"She's not my wife," Apache swore, voice like thunder rolling across the plains. But the baby in her arms, his eyes, his skin, his blood proved him wrong. Asterisk before starting the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Wooden floorboards of the sheriff's office groaned under the weight of silence. Dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of sunlight sneaking through the blinds, but the air was heavy, charged like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Apache stood there in the middle of the room, broad shoulders squared, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. His dark eyes were narrowed, but there was a flicker of something deeper, something dangerous beneath the fury. "She's not my wife," he growled, his voice low but sharp enough to cut the tension in two. "You hear me, Sheriff? Not my wife, not my problem." His words struck the small crowd gathered near the door like a whip. A few townsfolk gasped, others murmured, their whispers crawling up the walls like restless spiders. This was a town that thrived on rumors, and this one was hotter than a July prairie fire. The sheriff, a man with silver whiskers and a gut that had known too many pies, leaned back in his chair, his boots propped on the desk. He chewed his toothpick slow, watching Apache like a man who'd seen tempests blow through before. "Funny," the sheriff said at last, his voice steady as a church bell. "Funny how you say that, 'cause the lady here's been mighty sure about you being her husband. And that little one she's carrying." All heads turned toward the woman. She stood near the back, framed in the doorway like a ghost come home. Her dress was plain, worn at the edges, her hair swept back in a loose bun that had lost its battle with the day's heat. But it wasn't her clothes that held the room, it was the baby in her arms, swaddled in a faded blanket, asleep against her chest. Her eyes, though, told a different story than her calm stance. They were sharp, almost unyielding, like a hawk circling the desert sky. When Apache met her gaze, he flinched, not visibly, not enough for the crowd to notice, but inside, a strike landed. "You can shout all you want," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But denial doesn't change the truth." The room stirred again, the whispers rising into a steady hum. Apache's hands curled into fists. He wanted to spit fire, to crush the accusation under the weight of his pride. He was Apache, the rider, the fighter, the man who walked away from everything and everyone to keep his freedom. He owed nothing to this town. He owed nothing to her. And yet, the baby stirred, a soft sound escaping its lips. Just a coo, a breath. But it was enough to silence him. Apache forced himself to look away, forced his eyes back to the sheriff. "You're being played," Apache snapped, but his voice cracked under the strain. "She's after something, maybe money, maybe pity from the town. But I tell you, Sheriff, I never married her. Never." The sheriff tapped the toothpick against his teeth, then slowly leaned forward, placing both boots back on the ground. His gaze slid between Apache and the woman like a man studying a riddle he already knew the answer to. "Thing is," the sheriff said, "that baby's got eyes like yours. Same steel gray. Hard to argue with something staring you in the face." The words landed heavy. Some folks chuckled under their breath, others nodded, their judgment already painted across their faces. Apache's blood boiled. He wanted to shout, to swear, to tear the whole town apart with his bare hands if it would make them shut up. Instead, he did what he always did when cornered. He stood taller, colder, harder. "Eyes can lie," Apache muttered, though he didn't believe it. Not entirely. The woman shifted the baby in her arms and stepped forward. Every creak of the floorboards was a hammer against his chest. She stopped just inches away, so close he could smell the faint lavender on her skin, the same scent he thought he'd forgotten long ago. "This child," she whispered, though her voice carried across the room, "is the truth you tried to bury." Apache froze. His breath caught in his chest, his heart pounding against ribs that suddenly felt too small to hold it. For a fleeting second, he couldn't tell if it was the crowd's stares that burned him alive, or her eyes, and the baby god help him. The baby looked so much like him, it was as if a mirror had been placed in her arms. But pride was a stubborn beast, and Apache had ridden it too long to dismount now. "She's not my wife," he repeated, but this time his voice lacked thunder. It was little more than a whisper, carried away by the baby's soft breathing. The crowd heard the words, but they didn't believe them. And deep down, neither did Apache. The sheriff's office had never felt smaller. With every breath, the air seemed to thicken until it clung to the skin like wet wool. Apache stood rigid, trying to make his shadow look bigger than his guilt. But the woman his accuser stepped forward, her chin lifted, her eyes cutting through the haze of whispers. The crowd hushed. Everyone knew the moment belonged to her. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice steady though her hands tightened on the bundle in her arms. "And I was his wife." The words hit harder than a hammer to steel. A murmur ran through the onlookers, boots scuffing against the floorboards, skirts rustling like dry leaves in the wind. The sheriff didn't move, didn't blink. He leaned back in his chair as though waiting for the storm to unfold on its own. Apache's jaw flexed. "Lies," he spat. Though his voice lacked the fire of moments ago, Clara ignored him. She looked to the sheriff, then to the people watching, and finally back at the man who once held her heart. "5 years ago," she began, her words slow, measured, "I stood in a little chapel at the edge of Santa Fe. He was there, this man standing beside me with vows on his lips. He promised me a life, a future. He said I was his." Her voice cracked not with weakness, but with the weight of memory. She pressed the baby closer to her chest, as though the child was both shield and proof. "And when he rode away," she continued, her tone tightening, "he left more than broken vows. He left me with a child in my belly, no family, no name to protect me. I bore the shame while he wore his freedom." The crowd shifted uneasily. They'd seen Clara in town before, quiet, reserved, never stirring trouble. No one had guessed her past carried such a storm. Apache felt the eyes boring into him, and for the first time in years, the fire in his chest wasn't anger, it was shame. Memories clawed at him. The chapel she spoke of was no lie. He remembered her smile under the candlelight, the way her hand trembled in his but held fast. He remembered whispering promises he meant at the time, promises he abandoned when duty and danger pulled him away. He tried to smother the memory, to lock it away with all the ghosts he carried. But Clara's voice tore the lock clean off. "You don't get to stand here and pretend you don't know me," she said, her eyes blazing. "You don't get to look at your own son and call him nothing." At the word son, Apache's breath caught. He glanced at the baby, who stirred again, tiny fists clenching in sleep. The resemblance was undeniable, so sharp it cut straight through his armor. The sheriff finally leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "That's a heavy claim, ma'am," he said. "You saying you got proof of this union?" Clara met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "I don't carry papers. We were married by a traveling preacher who asked nothing but our vows. But I carry this." She slipped one hand beneath her dress collar and pulled out a silver chain. Dangling from it was a thin copper ring, worn smooth with time. "He gave me this. Said it bound us forever." The room fell so quiet the baby's soft breathing filled the silence. Apache's heart lurched. He remembered that ring, hammered from scrap copper in a blacksmith's fire, pressed into her palm with a trembling smile. He had no money, no land, nothing to offer but that crude circle and his word. And he had broken both. "She lies," Apache forced out, but it sounded hollow. Even to him Clara stepped closer, so near that he could see the fire in her eyes. "If I lie, then tell me, why does your son bear your face? Why does he have your eyes, your blood?" The baby stirred again, a soft cry slipping into the air. It wasn't loud, but it carried more truth than either of them could deny. The sheriff sat back, the toothpick between his teeth forgotten. "Seems to me," he said slowly, "the lady's story's got the weight of truth. And that little one there, well, hard to argue with a mirror." The townsfolk murmured again, louder this time, judgment tilting in Clara's favor. Some glared at Apache, others whispered behind their hands, but the verdict was clear. Clara didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply stood taller, clutching her child, her voice quiet but unshakable. "I don't need this town's pity, and I don't need your mercy. I came for the truth. If you've got the courage, Apache, look at your son and tell him you don't know him." The challenge hung heavy in the air. Apache's throat worked, but no words came. His fists clenched. His pride screamed for him to fight, to deny, to ride away like he always had. But his heart, the heart he thought long buried, stumbled. And for the first time, the man who had outrun every law, every bullet, every memory, realized there was one truth he couldn't escape. The office had grown still again, as though every soul inside was holding its breath. The storm of judgment had passed for the moment, leaving only the heavy silence of waiting. Apache stood rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed anywhere but on the woman and child before him. But the silence broke, not by the sheriff, nor by Clara, nor by the restless townsfolk. It broke with the soft, high-pitched cry of the baby. The sound was fragile, thin as a reed in the wind, yet it carried through the room like a gunshot. The infant shifted in Clara's arms, little hands stretching upward, fists unclenching as though reaching for something unseen, reaching for him. Apache tried not to see it. He told himself it meant nothing, just the random flailings of a child who didn't know the difference between shadows and flesh. But then the baby's eyes opened, and the weight of denial cracked under the truth staring back at him. Steel gray, the exact shade of his own. Townsfolk noticed too. A woman in a bonnet gasped and covered her mouth. A ranch hand muttered, "Spittin' image of him." The murmurs began again, but Apache no longer heard them. His ears roared with the pounding of his own heart. The child cooed, a soft bubbling sound that shouldn't have mattered, but it struck Apache harder than any accusation. It was innocence, pure and untainted, reaching across years of anger, shame, and pride. For the first time, he didn't see a trap, a claim, or a burden. He saw a son. His throat tightened. Memories clawed their way up his own father's face, distant and stern, the echo of harsh words and harsher nights. He had sworn once as a boy that he would never be that kind of man. And yet here he stood, repeating the same sins, leaving a child to grow up with only questions for company. The baby's tiny hand stretched again, this time curling in the air as though waiting to be taken. Apache's body betrayed him, his fingers twitched, his muscles leaned forward without command. A step, just a step, and he could bridge the distance. But pride pulled him back. He clenched his fists so tight his knuckles whitened. He told himself this was a trick of fate, that the child wasn't proof, only coincidence. Yet the lie rang hollow. No matter how he fought it, the truth was there in every feature of that small face. Clara shifted the baby gently, her eyes never leaving Apache. "He knows you," she said quietly. Not accusing, not pleading, just speaking the truth. Children don't lie. He knows his father. Apache's chest heaved. He wanted to shout, to deny, to shatter the fragile spell that moment wove around him. But the words turned to dust in his throat. The sheriff leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his voice low and measured. "Never seen a clearer mirror, Apache. Boy's got your eyes, your chin. He's blood of your blood. No sense fightin' what's plain to see." The crowd murmured agreement, but their voices barely reached him. All Apache could see was the small, fragile life staring at him with trust he hadn't earned, trust that cut deeper than hate ever could. He had faced bullets, blades, and betrayal without flinching. But one child's gaze broke him in ways no enemy ever had. For a moment, the mask cracked. His eyes softened, his fists loosened, and his lips parted as though he might speak. The crowd leaned in, Clara's breath caught. Hope flickered like a flame in her eyes, but the moment passed. Apache tore his gaze away, forcing steel back into his spine. He wouldn't bend. Not here, not now. To admit it would mean surrendering everything he had built. His freedom, his name, the hard armor of the lone rider who owed nothing to no one. And yet, as the baby yawned and nestled back against Clara's chest, Apache felt the truth burrow into his soul. A seed small and stubborn that would not die no matter how much he tried to starve it. He could deny the woman. He could deny the town. But he could no longer deny the child. The child was him, and innocence, unasked for, had already claimed him. The room was still, the baby dozing once more against Clara's chest, but Clara herself did not soften. If anything, she seemed carved sharper by the silence. She rocked her child slowly, her movements gentle, but her eyes, those eyes, Apache once remembered filled with laughter, were now hard with years of hurt. "You see him now," she said quietly, but her voice carried like a whip across the room. "You look at his face and you know what I've known every day since he was born. He's yours. And you weren't there." The words cut deep. Apache shifted, the floor creaking beneath his boots. But he said nothing. Clara went on, her voice trembling only once before steel returned. "You left me with nothing but whispers and shame. Do you know what it's like to walk into town with your belly showing, no husband at your side? To feel every eye burn into you, every tongue wag behind your back? To hear the words they used for me, words I wouldn't repeat in front of your son?" She paused, her chest heaving. The crowd, once eager to whisper, had gone quiet. Every word of hers struck like nails into Apache's coffin of pride. "I worked these hands raw," she continued, holding out one hand rough and calloused from years of toil. "I begged for scraps. I sewed until my fingers bled. I did everything to keep him fed, clothed, alive. And all the while, I carried your name like a curse. Not one day passed without someone reminding me what you'd done. Not one day I didn't wonder if you'd ride back, if maybe the man I married was more than a ghost." Her eyes glistened, but she refused to let tears fall. Clara had long since learned that tears gave her nothing. Instead, her anger burned hotter, fueling each word. "You thought leaving spared me?" she said, stepping closer, the child pressed tight to her chest. "You didn't spare me, Apache. You broke me. You left me to fight battles you should have stood beside me for. And you left him," she glanced at the baby, her voice cracking just once. "You left him to grow up without a father's arms." Apache's jaw tightened, his chest aching like he'd taken a bullet straight through. He wanted to speak, to tell her she was wrong, that he had left to shield her from the dangers that stalked him. But even as the thought formed, he knew how hollow it sounded. Protection meant standing by her side, not vanishing into the night like a coward. The sheriff leaned back, chewing slow on his toothpick, his eyes fixed on Apache. "Hard thing, hearing a woman speak truth plain as that," he said. "Most men break under less." The townsfolk nodded, some murmuring agreement, others shaking their heads at the sight of a man brought low by his own pride. Clara's voice softened, but the softness cut sharper than anger ever could. "Do you know the worst of it?" she asked, her eyes locking with his. "It wasn't the hunger. It wasn't the whispers. It wasn't even the nights I thought I'd die bringing him into this world with no one's hand to hold." Her lips trembled, and for the first time a single tear slid down her cheek. "The worst of it was believing you loved me once, and knowing that love wasn't strong enough to keep you here." The tears struck Apache harder than any gunshot. His throat tightened until it hurt to breathe. He had faced men with knives at his throat, bullets whistling past his head, and never once faltered. But here, before one woman's sorrow, he felt stripped bare, every excuse and lie crumbling like sand in a storm. The baby stirred again, yawning softly, and Clara kissed his brow before lifting her chin once more. "I don't need you now," she said, her voice low but steady. "I built a life without you." But she glanced down at the child. He deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know his father wasn't just a ghost who rode away. The words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on Apache like the weight of the mountains. His pride screamed to keep silent, to walk away, to remain the untouchable writer he had always been. But his heart was breaking under the sound of her pain. For the first time in years, Apache realized he was no longer running from enemies on the trail. He was running from the woman before him, from the life he could have had, from the son who bore his eyes, and there was no outrunning them now. By the time Clara's last words faded, the sheriff's office had become a furnace of whispers. The crowd no longer tried to keep quiet. Judgment rolled from their tongues like smoke from a prairie fire, thick and choking. "Always knew he was no good," muttered a farmer near the door. "Thought he was a man of honor," hissed another. "Poor woman, raising a child alone while he ran wild." The voices built, merging into a low roar until Apache felt the weight of every pair of eyes pressing against his back. He had faced gun barrels, ambushes, the merciless desert sun, but nothing ever burned like the heat of those stares. Sheriff Calloway rapped his knuckles against the desk, a sharp crack that silenced the room. "Enough," he barked, though his gaze lingered on Apache with a mixture of curiosity and disappointment. "This ain't no saloon brawl. It's a matter of truth. Truth." The word curled in Apache's gut like a rattlesnake. Clara shifted her son in her arms, rocking him gently as his soft cries ebbed into quiet breathing. The townsfolk's eyes followed her, some full of pity, some full of admiration. To them, she wasn't just a wronged woman anymore. She was a mother who'd carried her burden alone while the man beside her chased freedom. "She deserves better," someone muttered loud enough for all to hear. "Man's a coward if he don't claim his blood," another spat. Apache's fists twitched. Every instinct screamed to lash out, to fight the tide rising against him. He wanted to grab the nearest fool by the collar and snarl that they didn't know the truth. They didn't know what it had cost him to walk away. They didn't know about the men hunting him, the blood on his hands, the dangers he'd kept from Clara by leaving, but none of that mattered here. To these people, he wasn't a protector. He was a deserter. Sheriff Calloway stood, the floor creaking under his weight. "You all hush up," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of years in the saddle. He turned his attention squarely to Apache. "Now, you got the town's ear, son. You say she ain't your wife? That child ain't yours. But this here's your chance to prove it or admit it." Every gaze in the room pinned him in place. The silence that followed was louder than any gunshot. Apache swallowed hard, his throat dry as desert sand. He opened his mouth, ready to deny again, but the words snagged on the sight before him. Clara's face stern yet trembling with emotion. The baby's tiny hand curled around the fabric of her dress. The copper ring glinting against her breast, mocking him with memories he could never erase. "Speak." "Apache," Clara said softly, but her voice carried like a church bell. "Tell them I'm lying. Tell your son you don't know him." The crowd leaned forward. Breath held. Hearts waiting. For one terrible second, Apache thought he might crumble. He felt the truth clawing at him, demanding freedom. But his pride, his cursed, stubborn pride, rose up like a wall. If he admitted now, he would no longer be the man who walked his own trail. He'd be chained to her, to the child, to the town's judgment. And yet the judgment was already here. "I don't owe this town a damn thing," Apache said at last, his voice iron but brittle. "I don't owe her either. You all think you see the truth, but you're blind. You don't know me." A gasp rippled through the crowd. A woman in the back shook her head, muttering something about heartless men. A ranch hand spat on the floor, disgust clear on his face. Sheriff Calloway's jaw tightened. "Maybe we don't know you, Apache," he said, slow and steady. "But we know enough to see a man running from something that already caught him." The townsfolk murmured their agreement, the tide of opinion shifting into open condemnation. To them, Clara was no longer the outsider. They were rallying around her. Apache, once a figure of awe and fear, was being carved down to a villain in their eyes. Clara didn't gloat. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her stance stayed firm. She didn't need the town to crucify him. Their words only echoed what she already knew. Apache stood there, motionless, his pride cracking under the noise of their judgment. For the first time, he realized the battle wasn't between him and Clara. It was him against himself, and he was losing. The whispers of the townsfolk still echoed in Apache's ears long after the sheriff's gavel of words had silenced them. He stood rooted to the floor, but his mind was already far from that crowded office. One glance at Clara, the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and the walls he'd built inside himself began to crack. Memory came like a flood. He was younger then, though still hardened by the plains. He remembered the night he'd met her in Santa Fe. Clara had been carrying baskets of bread from the mission, her hair slipping loose from its braid, her laughter carried on the warm night breeze. He hadn't meant to notice her, but once he did, there was no undoing it. She was light, and he was shadow. Somehow, they had met in the middle. Apache clenched his fists at his sides. He hadn't lied that day in the chapel. When he stood before her with the preacher's words hanging in the air, when he pressed that copper ring into her hand, he had believed. For the first time, he thought maybe a man like him could put down roots, could love, could belong, but that dream hadn't lasted long. The memory shifted: firelight, the sound of horses, the stench of gunpowder. Men had come for him. He remembered their leader, a bounty hunter with a scar across his cheek, vowing to drag Apache back to face the gallows for blood spilled years before. Apache had left Clara sleeping, her hair spread across the pillow like gold in the moonlight. He hadn't even kissed her goodbye. He had told himself he was protecting her. If he stayed, she would have been marked as his, and his enemies would have used her against him. So he rode out, taking nothing but his gun, his horse, and his shame. And now, standing here years later, he saw what that decision had truly cost. Clara hadn't been spared his world, she'd been trapped in it alone. She had carried his child with no protection, no name to shield her from the cruelty of tongues sharper than knives. The image burned in his mind. Clara, heavy with child, facing the whispers of townsfolk who saw her as no more than a fallen woman. He had left her to fight battles that should have been his. His pride had told him it was mercy. The truth revealed it was cowardice. "Apache," Clara's voice pulled him back, steady but laced with something he hadn't heard in years, hurt, raw and unhealed. "You can stand there in silence all you like, but I remember every promise you made, every word. And I remember the day you broke them." He lifted his eyes, and for a moment their gazes locked. The years between them dissolved. He saw the girl he'd once held, the woman she had become, and the mother who stood unshaken before him. The sheriff cleared his throat, his tone cutting through the charged air. "Seems to me, Apache, there's more to this tale than you're letting on. Folks don't leave wives without reason. What drove you out?" The question hung there like a noose. The crowd leaned in, eager, hungry for the answer. Apache felt the weight of his past pressing against his chest, suffocating him. He wanted to tell them everything. About the bounty hunters, about the blood on his hands, about the life he thought he was sparing Clara from. He wanted them to know he hadn't left because he didn't care. He had left because he cared too much. But the words, never made it past his lips. Instead, he shook his head, the mask of pride settling back over his face. "The past is mine," he muttered, "and it dies with me." A ripple of disapproval swept through the crowd. To them, his silence was proof of guilt. Proof that Clara was right, that he was the kind of man who abandoned without cause. Only Clara looked at him differently. Not with triumph, not with victory, but with the deep, hollow sorrow of a woman who realized the man she once loved would rather choke on pride than speak the truth. And still, in her eyes, he saw the faint glimmer of what had once been. A glimmer he didn't deserve. The baby stirred again, and Clara gently rocked him, whispering words Apache couldn't hear. He wondered if she told the child of his father, the man who had loved, the man who had failed, the man who stood now in silence as his past carved him open. Apache turned away, his chest heaving. For the first time in years, the ghosts he thought he'd outrun had caught up. And this time, they wore the face of a woman and the eyes of a child. The baby's soft breathing was the only sound in the sheriff's office, but the silence was heavy as lead. Every person inside the townsfolk pressed against the door, the sheriff looming behind his desk. Clara, standing tall with her child, waited for one man to speak Apache, but his lips stayed sealed, his eyes hard as flint. He stood like a statue, broad shoulders squared, fists coiled at his sides, yet inside, the storm raged. Sheriff Calloway finally leaned forward, his chair creaking, and let out a long sigh. "I've let this play long enough," he said. "This ain't just town gossip anymore. It's blood, it's family, it's a boy's life hanging in the balance. So I'll put it plain, Apache, you claim or you walk out that door and turn your back for good. But you decide here, in front of all of us?" The words dropped like a gavel. The crowd stirred again. A rancher in the corner muttered, "Man's got no spine if he walks." A woman whispered to her neighbor, "Maybe now he'll do right." The pressure mounted with every breath, as though the room itself demanded justice. Clara said nothing. She only adjusted the baby in her arms and fixed her eyes on Apache. She didn't beg, didn't plead. Her silence was its own challenge, stronger than any words. Apache's chest rose and fell like a man bracing for a fist fight. He wanted to shout, to curse, to tear through the door and ride into the horizon where no one could touch him. That was who he'd always been, the rider, the loner, the man who bowed to nothing. But when he looked at Clara, he saw more than judgment. He saw the years carved into her face, the lines sorrow had etched, the strength she had built from ashes. And when he looked at the child, he saw a reflection of himself, a reflection that asked silently if he'd abandon him too. He swallowed hard. "Sheriff," he began, his voice low, gravelly, "you don't know what you're a skin. You think claiming him is just words. But it's more. It's chains. It means giving up the road, giving up the life I've built." "Life you've built?" A man from the crowd scoffed. "What life? Drifting from town to town, fighting like a stray dog? That ain't life. That's running." Apache's eyes flashed. He almost lunged, almost drew his fist, but then he caught Clara's gaze again. The fire in her eyes wasn't anger anymore. It was something else. Something that saw through the bluster to the man beneath. Sheriff Calloway tapped the desk. "So which is it, Apache? You walk out and stay the ghost you've always been, or you stand and be the man this woman says you once were. Ain't no third road." The silence that followed was unbearable. The crowd leaned forward, breaths held. Clara's lips parted, but she didn't speak. The baby stirred and whimpered, his small voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Apache's heart thudded in his chest. He remembered his father's cold eyes, the way the man had ridden off when he was no older than this child. He remembered the nights of waiting by a window, praying for a shadow that never returned. He had sworn he'd never be that man. And yet, Here he stood, staring at the same road. He felt the weight of every eye, every whisper, every choice pressing against him. His pride screamed to walk away. His soul begged him to stay. Finally, Apache's hands unclenched. His breath trembled as he spoke, the words heavy as stone. "I don't know if I'm the man you want me to be," he said, his voice breaking in the silence. "But I'll be damned if I let that boy grow up thinking his father turned his back." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara's eyes widened, tears brimming, though she blinked them back before they could fall. The sheriff nodded once, slow, as though justice had been served, but Apache didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, about to step into a life he didn't know if he could survive. Still, for the first time in years, he didn't turn away. The crowd outside the sheriff's office erupted into hushed chatter, the kind that comes when folks witness history shift in the span of a breath. Apache had spoken, maybe not the words they expected, maybe not a clean promise, but enough to change the air in the room. Clara stood very still, the baby snug in her arms, her eyes never leaving him. She wasn't smiling, not yet, but there was something softer in her gaze, like the faintest crack in a wall that had been stoned for too long. The sheriff cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Well, I reckon that settles it. Man's made his choice. Ain't no use dragging this any longer." He rose, heavy boots thudding on the wooden floor, and addressed the crowd at the door. "All right, folks, you've had your show. Go on about your business. Nothing more to see here," the townsfolk muttered. Some disappointed the drama was ending, others satisfied they'd gotten their verdict. One by one they trickled away, their boots scraping across the boardwalk outside. Soon the office was quieter again, just the sheriff, Clara, Apache, and the baby caught between them. Calloway tipped his hat, chewing slow on his toothpick. "You'll pardon me, but I've got real work to do. You two best figure the rest out yourselves." With that, he stepped outside, shutting the door behind him. For the first time, they were alone. Apache exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and despair. He'd faced death more times than he could count, yet somehow this moment standing before the woman he'd abandoned and the child who bore his blood was the hardest fight of all. Clara finally spoke. Her voice was steady but not unkind. "Words are easy, Apache. You've always had a way with them. But words don't mend years. Words don't feed a child. Actions do." He nodded once, solemn. "I know." The baby stirred, letting out a small whimper. Clara rocked him gently, but her eyes stayed on Apache. "He doesn't know you," she said, her voice softening. "He doesn't know what kind of man you are, what kind of man you'll be. But he deserves a chance to find out." Apache stepped closer, his boots creaking against the floorboards. He hesitated, then held out his hands. "May I?" Clara studied him, weighing the moment, then slowly shifted the child into his arms. Apache held the boy awkwardly at first. He was a man more familiar with pistols than infants, but as the child's tiny hand curled instinctively around his finger, something inside him broke open. The baby blinked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. And in that instant, Apache felt a weight heavier than any saddle, any gun, any burden he'd ever carried. Responsibility. He looked back at Clara, his voice low, raw. "I don't promise to be perfect. Hell, I don't even know if I can be the man you need me to be. But I swear this, I ain't ridden off again. Not from him. Not from you." Clara's lips trembled, and for the first time in years, she let a tear fall freely. "Do you mean that?" He swallowed hard. "By God, I do." The room was still, the moment hanging like a fragile thread between them. Then, slowly, Clara stepped closer, her hand brushing the baby's cheek, her fingers lingering just a heartbeat longer as they grazed Apache's. They stood there in silence, not as lovers reunited, not as enemies, but as something in between two broken souls trying to piece together a future neither had planned for. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of horses, wagons, and the endless hum of a town that would soon forget this day's drama. But for Apache, the world had shifted. The road that had always stretched wide before him now narrowed to a single path, one that led not into the horizon, but home. He looked once more at the child in his arms, at Clara standing beside him, and felt a strange thing settle in his chest. Not fear, not regret. Something steadier. Hope. And for a man who had lived his whole life running from ghosts, hope was the bravest decision of all.